I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co host, Reggie. We got off to a little late start this morning, ran into a couple of technical issues, but we were committed to bringing you all this show on this important topic. And we appreciate everyone who is still tuning in or waiting for us to get started. Definitely appreciate your patience. So, with that being said, Reggie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's good. It's good to be here. It's good to be able to hear each other without buzzing and all kinds of sounds in the background. But the morning is off to a good start for me.
Absolutely. I'm amazed sometimes when you take things for granted and things work a certain way, then you get hit with some snags. I learned that for me, it's best to just stay committed, test your perseverance, and then we just have to work through that. So I definitely appreciate your patience in working through that. So now with that being said, let's get started with our normal way we get our show started. What are you grateful for this morning?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to be here with you. I'm not going to move away from my gratefulness for breath and indoor plumbing and a refrigerator with food in it. But more specifically, I'm grateful that I'm coming really near to the end of a really solid 3-year project, which the preliminary stuff took me the better part of 7 years with this book that we've been talking about. And I'm just about 2 months from it going into print, which is terrifying at the same time that I'm grateful for it. But I'm really grateful for the many people and things that had to fall into place for me to continue to work on that project.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on completing the book and or get to the point where you're moving it forward, I should say. I know I'm in the process of still writing my book, so hopefully soon I'll be joining you in this process of editing and reviewing. I'm grateful this morning for my life, my health. Again, I'm also grateful for the ability to see, hear, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. And another 24 hours to really pursue my purpose in life. Yeah. I'm also grateful for the ability to, stay persistent and committed to, providing this show. I think it's a very important topic, and I'm definitely grateful for you hanging in there and continue to join me on this show, because I think that what we're building on here, I should say, is something that's necessary, and these conversations are necessary in order to really push forth better communication among not only the races, but the genders, ethnicities, political, all these other tribalisms that we're forced to be dealing with in this country. So those are my gratitudes this morning. And again, our topic today, we talked about having a 4-part series on a certain chapter of your book, which focuses on slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights. So again, for folks who may be new to the show, if you wouldn't mind just kind of setting up, title of your book, and what this chapter is about, and then we kind of get into our thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that, King. So the title of the book is Healing America's Narratives, and the subtitle is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. It's 12 chapters. 5 of the chapters highlight a specific issue in American history. Briefly, those are women's history, Native American history, African American history, the war in Vietnam, post 9/11, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The specific one we're talking about today is the chapter on African American history, and it deals with slavery, Jim Crow, the whole shebang. I mean, again, it's a selective history because it's one chapter in a book on a larger topic, but it takes a look at the current state of the country in the context of the history of the country. That's the goal of this chapter with regard to race and beginning with slavery.
Excellent. Of course, obviously this topic is important to me because that's basically my ancestors' history. And that's definitely something that is important to me. But at the same time, as a human and a person seeking to become fully human in my expression of growth, maturity, and really understanding what that encompasses. And then, like I said, connecting to that energy and that desire to not only become fully human within myself, but to express that to others Um, that's why I believe this work that we're doing is so important. Now, one of the things I really want to talk about as I read your chapter in the book that you shared with me, and then this is my own personal experience as a Black man coming up and dealing with all the issues and trauma and effects that going through each one of those cycles from slavery to Jim Crow to civil rights has led to. I would say, and there's a lot that we can unpack in there, but one of the things I really want to focus on in this comment is really kind of the legacy impact that that's had. And what I mean by that is, even the work that I do now, I liken this, it's an old African proverb that says, the way you train an elephant is you take a stake in the ground and you put a chain around that stake, and you put a chain around the other end around the elephant's leg. And so now the elephant can't move. You know, the stake in the ground is such a strong chain, the elephant's forced to only walk in as long as to the length of the chain. And then you keep that elephant like that for years. And eventually you can remove the chain and just replace it with a string, and the elephant won't break that string because it's been conditioned to only walk within that parameter that the chain allowed them to. And I mention that because that's what I see happening today. The legacy of the slavery, the Jim Crow, fight for civil rights, is that so many people in my community have that, what I call, I got this from a psychiatrist by the name of Stigman, called learned helplessness. Yeah. Folks have accepted their victimless role, and for them, they feel this is the way life is, and they're not looking to make a change. And so what happens is, no matter what programs you can create, well-intentioned people that says, I want to come in, I want to help, they can't help because these folks are suffering from this learned helplessness. And I experienced this firsthand when I moved to Baltimore City, and I created a model called Conscious Communities, where we were buying properties in marginalized communities, oppressed and distressed communities for decades. And not only buying the properties, renovating the properties, and doing development without displacement to allow residents who are currently living in renting situations, not trying to attract new residents, but uplifting the current residents, put them in the properties. And then COVID hit, had 30 properties, and those tenants that had gave me all the amens and agreed with me on my program, when I started, when they didn't have to pay rent because of COVID and I couldn't evict them, they chose not to pay rent, put me in a serious financial bind. So I mentioned that whole story because that's what I see, still the legacy of people still believing that I can't get along because I'm Black, or I can't buy a house because I'm Black. And they still believe in that because that's what they were conditioned to accept as a result of the legacy of the slavery and the Jim Crow era that we've actually gone through in this country.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, just as a quick side comment to what you said, I really both respect and appreciate and admire the work you're doing in Baltimore, because it's purposeful, it's unfortunately necessary, and there are not a lot of people that you're the first person I know that's doing it. So not that I have, I'm in touch with a lot of inner cities throughout the country, but I just really appreciate, your convictions and your commitment to doing that work.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So was there a question in there? So, I mean, I get the context that you set up. Where do we want to go with this?
Yeah. So basically, I want to kind of get your perspective on that, because I see you as we like to say within our Black community, whites we get to deal with, as an ally, right? That you are a person who has the emotional intelligence. You're a person who's looking to become fully human at journey as well. Mm-hmm. And you're not suffering from as you talk about in your book, Carl Jung's, that you're not letting that shadow of your negative self come out. And so my question for you now, with that learned helplessness there and people still suffering from that kind of trauma, how do you see your way of being able to awaken or do your part to move society further as we go forward?
Yeah, so great, and I think that's a really important question. And the first And it's a complex answer. And I'm not, and when I say answer, I'm not suggesting that I know exactly the right way for every human being to navigate that. But the one thing I feel comfortable saying out loud is that for those of us who are trying to move the conversation forward, become more fully human, and include as many other human beings in our efforts, I think the first really essential thing is that we accept each other and everyone right where he or she is when we meet them. Instead, don't make somebody wrong because they see things differently, because somebody does have a habitual or an intergenerational sense of learned helplessness. We don't want to meet them and say, well, that's just wrong. That's not true anymore. That's not a helpful approach. So understanding how somebody is and why, to the extent we can understand the why of this learned helplessness, when I use a kind of a blanket term of cultural givens, where all of the circumstances at any one of our births, location, date, and when I say date, I don't mean which day of the year, but what year, basically, ethnicity, culture of origin, parental influences, gradually allowing someone who, let's say, someone who has this sense of learned helplessness, to interrogate their beliefs. That's kind of a strong word, to inquire into their beliefs, question their beliefs, because you and I both know that if you take 2 people or 5 people born into exactly the same circumstances, whether it's a rich real estate heir in the suburbs or it's a really, really poor person in inner city, 2 people in exactly the same place might have very different lives. So somebody inherits the arrogance of the heir, whereas another heir might just realize, wow, how lucky I am. I'm going to help the rest of the world catch up. Somebody who's been born into a really difficult birth might say, I don't like this. I'm going to work my way out of this. And somebody else might say, this is just too hard. I can't do it. So that's the mystery that I am intrigued by. Why 2 people with pretty similar circumstances, even in the same family sometimes, end up manifesting very, very different lives. But I think, again, the first piece is, accept somebody where he or she is. Even if I want to metaphorically take them by the throat and say, stop it, can't you see you're your own worst enemy? That doesn't, on a rare occasion when everything else has failed, not really grabbing somebody by the throat, but making a real forceful statement, that can help, but it's not the first move into it. By any stretch of the imagination. So accept people where they are, and then begin to ask them questions and teach them how to question their own beliefs and worldview, because that's how we create awareness. You don't have to have the answers as a coach or a counselor or a mentor, but you need to be able to ask good questions, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I know that for me, again, speaking from my perspective of being someone who's out in the community, and dedicated his life to having a higher purpose and accepting that purpose as a person who is to uplift and have transformed the lives of others and provide folks with the opportunities that have not historically been available to us. And I know that I've been a recipient of certain opportunities and blessings. And that's namely because, to your point, my parents instilled in me at an early age the love for reading. And I think that's what the common denominator is, to be honest. I think that if you read and you like to read, then that's going to at least be the first criteria. Because if you're not a person who doesn't read, I think, again, this is only from my perspective. I'm not saying it's a fact or this is the law, it's just my perspective. I think it's very difficult for a person who doesn't read to open their mind, to have a growth mindset, so to speak. Yeah. And I do another podcast with a doctor, and she joined our show before, Dr. Kristen Elkelson.
Yeah.
And we talk about the growth mindset. And see, I think that's what kind of, I know for me, separates me from a lot of people. I'm not talking about just Black people, I'm just saying people in general, is that I believe I have a growth mindset. And I strive to make that happen on a daily basis. It's not something you just accept and say, I have it. It's something that you work towards. Because as you and I discussed, you can have a growth mindset when it comes to things such as racial issues, right? Because that affected me personally. But you can have a fixed mindset when it comes to political issues. You might say, I don't hear anything the Republicans are saying because I don't agree with that logic. And so for me, working towards that on a daily goal of having a growth mindset in every area, and that's a work in progress. But anyway, my point of with the foundation of having a growth mindset is reading. So when you say accept people where they are, I find it difficult that if a person is not going to read, but yet and still they stand firm and fast in their belief that whether it's I'm a victim and there's still this, and I know there's definitely still racist systems in place. And that's what I tell folks. That's my argument is I don't believe the country is racist anymore. I don't believe America as a society is racist or no one wants to be racist, right? But I definitely know that there's racist systems in place that still keep things from being fair and just. And that's where I believe our energies and efforts should be put into dismantling those systems. But even if you have a plan, if you read and you have a plan, you can still maneuver through those racist systems, even though it's a challenge and it's difficult and it's a much harder road. But there is the possibility of success if you apply yourself. But it begins with that reading. And so that's where I want to kind of go with. I know you're an avid reader. Obviously, your background has a library of books, and I know you've written several books. So let me kind of shift the question to this, let's set that context. In the way you were raised, in your community, maybe in your own personal family, how important was reading instilled in you at an early age?
Yeah, I was gonna answer that question even if you hadn't asked it, based on what you just said. So in chapter 1 of the book, I list my cultural givens, the things I was given as a little kid. The truths about the world. This is in the late 50s, early 60s. Among them were things about the Catholic Church being one true church. America's the greatest country in the world. People are all good, but it's better if you're Italian American. All that kind of stuff. All the things that my family believed. Some they held lightly. Some they, like the Catholicism in America as the best country, were really, you didn't believe in those things, you got in trouble. But so I have a list of, I don't know, there's 20 or 25 cultural givens, and the last two are these two. The New York Yankees are the best baseball team ever because they've won more World Series championships. And also reading is a good thing to do because when I first began to go to school, there was a set of encyclopedias, children's encyclopedias in the house. There was children's dictionary, and there were a lot of different books to read. So reading was very much encouraged. So my joke is those last two, the Yankees, and again, I say that mostly as a joke, but the Yankees winning the most World Series and reading being a good thing to do are the only two things I was given as a kid, not counting loving each other and being a good person, but about the world at large that held up over time. So reading was very important. My mother was a first grade teacher. My father was a plumber, and he read, not as much as I do or as my mother did, but he did read, and he was an educated man through high school. But reading was strongly encouraged, and I fell in love with it. And I think what we bump into today, I'm thinking of different ways I can get in trouble for saying this, but I'll say it anyway. When you have a book in your hands, and even if it's like a Kindle or Nook, an e-reader type thing, you're making a commitment to go into a relationship with this book or this author. And there's a commitment involved, and it's active. Nowadays, we have access to a ridiculous amount of information. We have so much, just online, we can search everything. We can, there's 100,000 podcasts out there. All right. There's all these recordings, there's all of this stuff. And it's a different experience. Not that you can't learn from a good YouTube speech or TED Talk or whatever it happens to be, but there's a level of commitment that's saying, okay, this is here, I'll hold one up. Because you and I have been talking about this. So here's Kendi's stamp from the beginning. And it's not a thin book. right? But even with a thinner book, there's another one. There's a commitment that you make or that I make or someone makes when we say, okay, I'm going to read this book. I'm going to enter a relationship with this author. That's very different from scrolling through YouTube videos and different audios and different things like that. So I don't want to say that reading a book is the only way to make that commitment, but I still think it's among the best, and including what began as books on tape. Now there's Audible and those type of things. If you make the commitment and really listen to the whole book, it's not exactly the same experience, but it's close. And I think that's part of the challenge nowadays, because for some people they think books are old fashioned or out of date because they have access to so much information in so many different ways. But the attention span gets distracted if you're scrolling through YouTube or any other source of information, I think. So I kind of went off, I know, a little bit of a tangent there, but I want to come back to really agree with you on the commitment to reading. And that includes listening to a book, Audible. I go in quotation marks because it's old fashioned, books on tape, which were a big thing, I don't know, a couple of decades ago. But I like to put my eyes on a written page. That's my preference.
Well, to that point, my preference is pretty much all three. And I do that because my goal is to really, as Stephen R. Covey talks about, I want to learn it to teach it.
Yeah.
Right? And so I consume it by reading a book. Then I also listen to the audio book when I'm driving. Then I research the author on YouTube and see if they got any TED Talks or any kind of presentation. So I really consume it in all three areas, right? So that I really learn that information, especially if it's something that I'm really interested in understanding, and then not only understanding but applying.
Right.
And that, that shifts now to a book that was recommended to not me personally, but recommended one of his speeches, the late great Jim Rohn. He talks about a book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler.
Yeah.
And that book to me was just a phenomenal book. It's not an easy read, but it breaks down the difference between reading for education versus reading for entertainment versus reading for information. And then how you have to change your process of how you read based off that. Right? A lot of people say, yeah, I read, but if you're just reading books that are strictly fiction, just to be swept away in different fantasies. Again, I'm not judging anybody who does that. That's one way of just consuming information, as opposed to I want to read because I want to understand this topic, or I want to understand this particular area. I want to grow my mind. I want to think differently as a result of reading this material. And I think that's, to me, as we talk about going back now to our original topic of slavery, Jim Crow, and then civil rights, I still believe, as a person, like I said, whose ancestors have gone through it, and that's my perspective, that the first step towards changing the way you think and operating is developing that skill of reading, right? And reading for education, not just reading for entertainment purposes. If you read a TV guide, it could be something, but we don't have those anymore. But he references a TV guide as reading for entertainment. Then the next shift is this: is once you begin to read, is now beginning to listen. I think those two things have been what's been transformational in my life. But again, that's coming from reading first. I can tell folks one of the most impactful, influential books I've ever read and still continue to read on a daily basis. It's my Bible. It's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. And one of the fifth habits is seeking to understand before you can be understood. So listening, and he talks about how most of us never trained to listen. Yeah. We quiet and we listen to, we're quiet and let another person how to, being respectful and courteous, we allow the other person to finish their thought. But the whole time, most people's head, we just thinking about what we want to say. That's what we're focused on. And we're pretty much missing what they're saying. Yeah. So learning to listen is a trained skill. So I say all that to say, as we begin to talk about possible solutions of how to really change the course of that that chain legacy that's still on a generation of folks or a race of folks who've gone through Jim Crow, slavery, and then civil rights. It's those two things that I'm advocating for: reading first and then learn to listen second. And if you adopt those two habits, again, it doesn't shift the world, doesn't make the world just, doesn't make it equitable, but in your own mind, that's where it begins with. You now begin to start processing and viewing the world differently by really honing on those two skills. And I just kind of want to get your feedback on what you, as a person who writes and as a reader and as an educator, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so across the board, I agree, but I want to get really specific in my agreement. And then it just has an asterisk too. So I do listen to things and when I drive, and I do use YouTube and TED Talks to find out more, I like to get a sense of the person and of an author. And sometimes you can get a really good sense about how they are on a stage as opposed to how they are on the page. Yes. I didn't mean to rhyme that, but it came out that way. So I use all three too, but my bias is definitely is the reading. Yeah, and I would add of Covey's 7 Habits, the one that I'm most biased to, and all 7 of them I bought that book when it came out as well, and gave it to people I was working with before I even read it myself. Said, you should read this. I mean, I'm joking a little bit. But, I think it's the 7th habit, and I haven't looked at the book in a while, but I think it's number 7 is sharpen the saw. Right. And, my bias is around ongoing development. So that's exactly, that piece. But I agree, because reading and listening and true listening, so reading for education, reading to learn, and listening deeply, if you're really doing either of those, if I'm really doing either of those, by default, my awareness begins to expand. I'm being exposed to things I haven't heard before or didn't know before. Now, I can still say I don't agree with that, something new, but I'm exposed to a bigger picture, and that's how we grow, by being exposed to ever expanding views of the world, let's say, bigger perspectives, and I agree. It's the hard piece is when you bump up against someone who's stuck in life and who is both stuck and thinks they know it all. And that's the place where, well, why should I read? I already know how the world is. It's this and it's this. It's, winners and losers. It's black and white. And I don't mean that in terms of skin pigmentation, but just those two contrasts. Yeah, but you seem to be stuck. So might it be worth a risk to at least listen to somebody who has a different view and really listen, as opposed to just enter an argument? But that's the most difficult place to be, and I don't have the solution to that. When someone doesn't want to grow, doesn't want to read, doesn't want to listen, because he or she believes, this is the way the world is, and no one's going to tell me any different. That's the place where if somebody can bump into, the beginning of a way to tap the chisel point on that particular mindset and shake it up a little bit. I mean, that would be a real big deal. That kind of closed mindedness, while still being stuck.
Right. But then I think it goes back to, you and I talked about this before, in previous sessions of the show, that, like, for me, I'm an engineer in training, and I'm always an on or off type thinking. And a lot of, I understand there is gray area, but I'm quick to either get to, it's either black or it's white. Again, I'm not referring to pigmentation, but I'm talking about facts, right? And when I say that, what I mean by that is this, that I believe that there is no value in hate. To me, it's a wasted emotion, right? I don't see the logic behind having hate in my mind. I know it's there, it could be triggered, obviously. Mm-hmm. But again, on my journey to become fully human and self mastery, I want to get rid of hate and I want to get rid of ego. And that's something I have to push down every single day. It's not some in game. But I say this to my point is this: if you have hate, and that's where I'm going with this, then and your fixed mind, then you will forever stay stuck, right? If you're saying, okay, this is how the world has been, right? If you believe that America is racist, or that you believe every white person is racist, or if a white person believes every black person is a criminal or a thug or lazy, whatever we want to bias or characteristic we want to attach to a particular person, if you believe that and then you add hate to that, you're not changing. And for me, what I realized, and again, it's my own personal decision, I have no interest in trying to change that person. It's like, to me, you're like that road, use analogy of you're like a bad road out of potholes. I'm not going to sit here and try to navigate down that road and dodge those potholes. I'm just going to avoid that road altogether and go a different route. And so I'm going to avoid that person altogether, because at this stage of my life, I want to be built on, or I want to connect with people who have great energy, who are growth minded, and looking for ways to form solutions to problems. And I don't judge anyone anymore, and I used to. That's a growth minded in me. So if your sexual orientation is different, I don't care. If your race is different, I don't care. If your religion is one way or another, as long as that religion doesn't force you to be judgmental and start holding other people critical, as long as you're open for the idea of growth and you want to change and you want to make the world a better place by bringing forth positive, progressive action, I'm open to those conversations with you. Even though we may disagree how we get there, I'm open to those discussions and exploring ways that we both can co-create a better world. And for me, that's what I would say. Again, going through the history of, slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights. And again, I say this, and I want to use this kind of, I would say, this direction on this conversation, because, yeah, we could talk about all the atrocities and all the trauma, and that's been talked about in each one of those eras. And there will be a time for that, over the next 2 times we had this discussion. But I really want to focus on how I believe as an individual, what I recommend people can now begin to say, how can I, understanding this, when reading this, and I think every person needs to read it. They need to understand it, if you're black, you're white, Asian, whatever your race and ethnicity may be. You need to understand the history of this country, but don't understand it from, I'm going to learn to hate people from it or dislike people from it, but learn it from a context that I need to understand the origin of it, the history of it, so that when I see someone else, I can have the emotional intelligence to be empathetic and now not judge them or have the bias. I can understand why this person's acting the way and just judge the behavior. So I'm a person that believes you don't judge the person, you judge the behaviors. So the behavior is stuckness. I judge your stuckness and choose not to deal with it. So again, I know I said quite a bit there, but I just wanted to get your thoughts and perspective on that as well. How do you go about building connections with people, interacting with people, and what is your way of dealing with those folks who are stuck?
Yes. So and I love that last piece you said too, is really kind of the foundation of Kendi's, racist versus anti-racist behavior, where he basically says, if you judge an entire race or group based on the behavior of one individual, that's racist. If you see an individual do something that's wrong or bad and just judge it as that behavior of that individual is wrong or bad, that's anti-racist. So you're not saying because that person was white and did that, all white people are bad, or that person was black and did that, all black people. You don't make that projection onto a full group. So the way you just articulated the last piece was really clear. And there's one anecdote, if it's okay with you, so I wanted to share, because it's tied in with that piece of the people who seem not to want to change. And sometimes the only way they can change is if the world or the universe gives them an unforeseen opportunity. The Southern Poverty Law Center, founded in Montgomery, Alabama, decades ago now, and they've been working for, I guess, 50 years. Basically, they sue the organizations behind bias crimes. And
Hmm.
they sue in civil court and they get their money and their assets and they give the rewards to the victims of the crime or the survivors of the victim. They've done that work for years. And there was a story in their intelligence report, this goes back 20 years or more, of a young man who was in the Marines, white guy, in the Marines, was recruited in the Marines. This is not to be deprecatory about the United States Marine Corps, but this is what happened. Recruited in the Marines by a white supremacist group in the Marines, got out, did his service, got out. And then what they would do is they would go into local towns, and this was in the South, I forget exactly where, and they would go, hang out outside of high schools. And they would tell the white kids that a group of black kids was planning to do something. So they would basically incite racial fights, and then they would help the white kids and then recruit them into their organization. He did this for years. He did time in jail. He got out. He continued doing it. Ended up having a 4-year-old son. And one day he was with his son wherever they were living. And the TV was on. And the way it was described in this anecdote was that there was a Jamaican singer singing a song. I always just assumed it was Harry Belafonte for some reason. So, that was in my mind when I first read it. And the 4-year-old son went up to the TV and turned it off. And the father said, "Why'd you turn that off?" And the 4-year-old said, "Because we don't watch shows with the N-word in this house." So this kid at 4 had learned that from his father. Within about 48 hours of that, this father began the process, not an easy process, of truncating his relationships with the white supremacist group. And he ended up becoming an informer for the FBI and local law enforcement and Southern Poverty Law Center. So he became one of their experts in how these racist groups work. So the question that comes up for me as we talk about people who don't want to change, I mean, this was a guy doing really bad things.
Right.
It wasn't like he had an unskillful moment and said something he regretted. I mean, for years he was doing this, but there was a rawness. There was this moment when his account of it, basically, he said, I knew what my life was like, and I saw the prospect of my son having a life like mine, and something shifted in me. That's my memory of how he explained it. And his name was public. I forget his name. So I think it's this idea of even someone who seems lost and beyond help, given the right circumstances, can wake up that way. But I don't know how that happens. Like there's not a formula there. And that's not a guy I would spend a lot of time while he was in the white supremacist group and he didn't want help. I think that's I'm going to take the other road. I'm not going down that road with him.
Right.
I don't have the skill set to do that. I don't know how to do that.
I'm sorry, I may cut you off, but it reminds me, that story you just shared reminds me of, it's a gentleman, he's a former blues and rock and roll band player. He plays the drums. And he's a big black guy. And he's put out a series of YouTube TED Talks, and he actually has a DVD. But basically what he does is, I'm forgetting his name, and I hate not to be able to mention his name. I definitely have it for the next show. But what he's done is he goes out and he talks to clan members. And I'm talking about like the imperial wizards within the clan. Mm-hmm. And he's been invited to attend a clan rally. He's the only black man who's actually attended a clan rally and was able to live and tell about it. Yeah. But my point is, he gets these imperial wizards, and they give him their robes. They denounce the clay, and give him their robes. And he has like a whole collection of imperial clan wizards robes that he's collected over the years. And he shows how it all started with he wanted to meet a clan member, and because he refused to accept. He said he went through a similar experience where someone called him an N-word and they said they hated him, and he just refused to accept someone can hate him without knowing him. He said, "I just refuse to accept you can hate me because of the color of my skin. So I just got to have this conversation with someone. He wanted to put the energy into that. So he hired a white friend of his to set up a meeting where he would do an interview with this Klan member at a hotel. The Klan member thought he was being interviewed by a white person. He walks into the room, there's this black man, and he says, instantly, the tension was there, and he said he was ready for the hostility, but he calmed his energy down, and the Klan member calmed his energy down. They ended up having a conversation. And that was the first time he had that interaction. And they sat there, they drank beer, they talked, and they shared all their bias toward each other. But at the end of the day, they came away with a better understanding of each other. And eventually it led to a friendship. And that friendship led to him having the confidence to do more of those meetings. And he's definitely someone I definitely encourage people to read as you talk about being fully human, because to you and our points, he likes to go down those roads of those potholes. He seeks them. And he's been very successful at paving those roads over and showing that behind those people who you think were at the height of hatefulness, that there's still some human there in them, and they can be on their road to fully human. It's not that they go out and they love black people; they actually love and see him differently. But still, that's still a monumental shift, a paradigm in their thinking.
Yeah, well, and that I love that example. I mean, and there's a lot of there are decades of research now that show that close personal contact with people we think are different from us is one of the most powerful, I don't want to say tools, but interactions or ways of beginning to break down those barriers. So the first piece that I learned about was they did research on those Germans who actually helped hide Jews during the Holocaust. And there was only one trait that separated those who helped hide the Jews from those who didn't. And that trait was that those who helped hide the Jews had previous ongoing personal contact, whether it was a shop owner or it was somebody who worked in their own store or was in the neighborhood, and they knew the Jewish people as opposed to just hearing about them. And there's additional evidence that shows that doesn't really work online so much. Like if you have close personal contact with someone on Twitter, for example, where it's just a written thing online, that doesn't break down the barriers as much. In fact, often it builds them up. But the idea of this drummer that you're referring to risk that close personal contact begins to break down barriers, because it gets harder to not see the other's humanity if it's in fact personal contact and it's intentional and it's not, you're not being forced to do it. So I love that example, and I believe it's not the only way, but I believe that's a powerful way. Do you know any Jews? Do you know any blacks? Do you know any whites? Do you know any Iranians? Oh no, well maybe meet with one or several, have a conversation, and see what happens. But I think in this country we're terrified of each other.
Absolutely.
Not everybody, but go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm just going to say, I'm just agreeing with you. I mean, I think the media helps perpetuate that as well.
Yeah.
The media, continue to tell you that you're a part of this tribe, and this is how this tribe operates, and this is how this tribe functions and thinks. The gentleman's name now that come to mind is named Daryl Davis.
Okay.
If you Google him, you definitely see his TED Talk. It's phenomenal. Yeah. Like I said, I ended up buying his DVD because it gets even more. Because I just was really just blown away. He's the only person I know who's ever done that. And like I say, he's a big black man where, not strong, but just big physically, where, he's not the type of man you're going to really, want to fight. But by the same token, the heart and the bravery it takes to attend a Klan rally, just based on the invitation of a man that tells you, come out, you're going to be safe. And this is a man who, has been bred and runs an organization that's intended on hatred and murder and violence. And you're going to trust that you can come and be safe under his protection. And he was, so that level of faith shows you. And that's what I find interesting about humanists. We talk about, again, if we kind of begin to bring the show to a close, being fully human at growth is when you get to the point where you begin to now start to trust the humanity in humans, and believe that people could be more show kindness, show compassion. And one other thing I want to share, and I'm always, going to always throw dog analogies in it, because again, I'm just new to the dog world, and I love my dog, and never thought I would be a dog person. Right? I used to always, again, I don't use the term hate, but I definitely dislike dog people. Right? Not people who own dogs, but people who just were obsessed with dogs.
Yeah.
But now that I own a dog, I see why. Yeah. And again, I see dogs, you really see truly unconditional love. It's like, again, I use this analogy of a dog park, and how I've taken my dog to a dog park, and dogs don't care whether or not what breed you are, what color the fur is, if you have 3 legs, 2 legs, they don't care. They smell your anus, and they get information from that, and based on your temperament, that's how they judge you, and then they begin to play, right? And so when you get into the dog world, you start to see things like that, and it would be great if humans, and again, think about the fact that you smell the anus, that's the most intimate thing, that we would definitely shun away from. That act of dogs not having those barriers and biases, it's just, this is how we communicate, this is how we get information, and now that I've smelled you, I understand you, that's interact, that's communicate, that's begin to enjoy the world together. And that's what I would love to see human beings do. Maybe not be able to act to smell each other's anuses, but get to the point where we find a common denominator to say, this is where we have commonality, and that's what we focus on. And that's not focus on our differences. But let's understand, respect the differences, but not let the differences cause us to have hatred and biases and misunderstandings toward one another.
Yeah, I mean, I love the analogy, and maybe in the absence of smelling each other's anuses, it's just, I mean, you probably get arrested for that. But more seriously, I mean, the idea that whether it's literally true or not, the eyes being the windows to the soul, is to really look into somebody else's eyes without, not inappropriately, and allow them to do the same, and hold that gaze for a few seconds, or even longer, intentionally, is a really intense experience. And you can really get a sense of that common humanity when we do that. So that might be our version of what the dogs do, and I'm sure there's others as well. I mean, deep listening is, and speaking honestly would fall in there as well. So I apologize for that little beeping sound that was on my end.
Well, as we close the show, we got to the top of the hour. We like to end the show with identifying a person that we believe is fully human, and then kind of explaining quickly why. So in 30 seconds, I'll go ahead and make my attempt, and you follow. I would say that my person that I want to hold up into today's show of being fully human as an example is Stephen R. Covey. And again, the reason I say it is because I read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People many times before I learned out that he was a Mormon. Mm-hmm. And I want to point that out because, not that I have any biases against Mormons, but I never felt that he was trying to persuade me or to pass on his religious dogma in his writings. It was like he was talking about truly being spiritual, understanding the principles. And even though he was a Mormon, he didn't convey that. And to me, like I said, he's not only changed my life, and I think he's changed the lives of millions of people. And his sons continue to do that in the works they're doing. So he's a person I want to hold up as being an example of a fully human individual.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think I'm going to go with, but one of the smaller book I held up before was a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas, who came across the Atlantic back in the 1400s, I believe, might have been just over the century into the 1500s, and was owned slaves for a while, and he was in the Caribbean, wasn't in North America, and was one of the people who early on suggested that the native peoples of the Caribbean were too gentle and weak to really be enslaved. So it would be a better idea to continue to import Africans to the New World as opposed to trying to enslave these weaker Tainos who were down there. And as he did that, he encountered more Franciscan friars, Catholic monks, and began to read on his own, and gradually became one of the primary, what Kendi calls anti-racist voices of the 1500s that saw the humanity in everyone and spoke out against what was going on in the Caribbean, and then was disowned by Spain. He was from Spain, and he was disowned. But his book, is a riveting discussion of the horrible things that the Spanish colonizers did when they arrived. But he's a guy who had that developmental move as well, and I didn't learn about him until about 10 years ago. So he's someone that I'm really grateful that has lived, and his work can still remind us of the importance of seeing each other as human beings. So that was kind of long, I know.
No problem. I appreciate you sharing that. Well, listening audience, that brings up another Fully Human Connections show to an end. Again, we do these each Wednesday at 10 a.m. and we're going to have a guest next week. We're going to reveal who that guest is, but they're going to join us in this conversation. So we have 2 more episodes on the topic of slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights that we're going to explore, and we're going to bring on different perspectives. But we hope you enjoyed the show. Again, our goal is not to try to solve or believe we have all the answers, but we're definitely committed to having a conversation and open to learn and growth as a result. So Reggie, thank you again for your investment time and energy and your insightfulness. Appreciate that. And listening audience, thank you all for listening. Until next week, everyone continue to have a blessed and productive week.
You're welcome, and thank you, King.